Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. Now, for a long while, the gold standards in Apple development weren't just defined in Silicon Valley, but in the temple town of Udupi, where Rohit Bhatt built Robosoft. Robosoft is an epic journey of over 2 decades that just culminated in an acquisition by the Japanese firm Technopro for over $100 million. I spoke to Rohit on how he founded the company when the Apple ecosystem, let alone the Indian startup ecosystem, wasn't as mature, about how he inspires engineers to do great work for clients and is able to scale that quality very consistently, and how he managed to build a successful game studio, 99 games on the side, while doing all of this. Speaking to Rohit, you feel like he is just getting started. And as he says, he wants to 10x things or perhaps 100x things with 99 games. This was a wonderful conversation with a seasoned entrepreneur. A lot of insights in here that you will appreciate. So let's get started on this episode of the Startup Operator Podcast with Rohit Bhatt of Robosoft and 99 Games. Hi, Rohit. Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hi, Roshan. Thanks for having me on this.
Yeah, delighted to have you. And congratulations on the acquisition. It must be a very bittersweet moment for you. As I was saying, I think after 25 years of being at the helm of Robosoft, you're moving on right now. So kind of like the end of one era and the beginning of another. So I wanted to check with you, to begin with, how does it feel now that, you're moving on from Robosoft, and what are some of the highlights and the lowlights of this current phase you're in?
Yeah, I think put it, rightly, Roshan, when you called it bittersweet, so on one side, you feel so happy, and on the other side, like, oh my God, is it really happening, kind of a thing. But yeah, it is happening and it is, slowly sinking in. But yeah, it is a long journey, but, very happy with the final outcome, both in terms of the actual outcome and the new suitor, that we have for Robosoft as a company.
Right. Startups are such a core part of the founder's identity, right? I mean, it's so core to who you are as a person. So, I wonder if you can take us through the emotions that you felt. Like, what does it feel like waking up the next morning when you realize that, you may not have to, probably go to the office or do all of these other things, or you have to prepare to, sort of bequeath this to someone else?
Honestly, it is not yet happened to me because there are all these smaller formalities that happen. And it is not that I sold it and I had to walk out the next day. So, I think I will be around in some smaller capacity for another 1 year because it's a 80-20 sale and the 20% will get, sold, next year. But yeah, when people call and congratulate me and tell, oh, what next? And I'm like, oh my God, what next? That is, and that's the question. But yeah, I think, it's kind of like a relief, on one side, on one side it is a happiness on that achievement, specifically about putting, Udupi on the global map. I think that probably, tops every other feeling that I get, that there is this, thing that we are able to make. Because over the history of Robosoft, I've heard, so many people telling us that, hey, look, you can't do it from Udupi. So yeah, right from, day one when I initially started in Mumbai, and in 2000 I, came back, and when I went there, people said, hey, look, you can't go to Udupi and start, it is not the place for you to do a high-tech business. And then, when we are trying to raise funds, and people said, you can't raise funds from Udupi. And, we raised, few rounds from Udupi. And then people are saying that now, we'll have a very hard time getting an exit from Udupi. And I think, we did that as well. So I think we have kind of, shown in a way that you can raise funds and you can exit, to a global player, all by being in a tier 2 or tier 3 town. I think that has given the the maximum satisfaction for me personally.
Right. Yeah, I think I said this before that, Udupi was known for two things: beautiful temples and, wonderful South Indian food, right? Breakfast. Yes. But now I think it's known for Robosoft as well, right? I think plenty of people have discovered Udupi because of Robosoft. One final question on the acquisition, and I'd love to move on other aspects, right? So you've spoken about the symbiotic fit that Technopro and Robosoft have, right? And if you can talk us through this process of looking for meaningful acquirers, and what was the sort of fit that you had with Technopro, and how did you discuss about why the two of you will be stronger going forward and so on. If you could take us through that.
Yeah, sure. So, this whole process of, finding an acquirer for or rather an investment or an exit, it started with giving an exit to our existing investors. So, we have Kalari invested in us since 2013 and Ascent Capital invested in us since, 2015. So, one is 13, one is 15, and, they were kind of close to their end of their fund and all those kind of things. And we had this conversation, last year about, giving them an exit. Okay. And we, as a company, we've been preparing it for some time now because we hired a professional CEO to run the company back in 2017. And Ravi Teja, who is the CEO, has been running the company for, some time now. And our intent back then was that I knew that at some stage, I want to move on and probably focus on the product entity. And for us to do that, we need to have somebody who has been there, run the company for some time. And I think we had that conversation middle of last year, and we started. We had a process. Basically, we engaged an investment banker, GCA, their investment global IB firm, their India office in Mumbai, and they have a strong practice in Japan and in USA as well. And we gave them the mandate to look for a potential suitor for Robosoft. And they ran this process. It's a proper process that they ran. They sent IM to so many different organizations. So GCA is based in several geo. They are based in Europe, USA, and Japan, Singapore, and all these countries. And their teams kind of spread it out wide. And we started getting a lot of active interest beginning from November of last year. And then it went into the new year, and we finalized 3 different players at the end of it. 2 PE players and 1 strategic. So TP for us was kind of like a strategic fit, whereas other entities were more of PE kind of firms. And while we continue to engage with all of them, we started understanding what was Technopro's intent and all. So they are based in, they're a $1.5 billion company based out of Tokyo. And Robosoft has seen some really strong traction in Japan in the last few years. And we started talking to them, and they were kind of telling us what is their future plan, and they wanted to keep the Robosoft brand as it is, and they wanted to kind of build on the whole digital transformation or the digital skill set that Robosoft had, and they wanted to carry the legacy forward. And for us, that was kind of like the magical thing. There's this company which wants to invest and probably take this company from whatever we were valued at, and probably take it 10 times higher. And that part of it kind of appealed to all of us, and all those commercial considerations were all there in the mix. But for me personally, that was pretty important thing when they said that, hey, look, they're going to grow the building and grow the company. They will work out of Udupi will still be their headquarters and all those kind of things. And at the end of it, everything, the negotiations, everything happened, and we finally signed on that day, 11th or 12th.
Right. Wonderful.
So another wonderful thing is that everything happened, online. So there was this acquisition which was 100% online. So it was pretty special that way.
Right. So let's talk about the Udupi connection, right? You started building Robosoft in Udupi way before, remote became the norm, before, people started building companies in tier 2, tier 3 cities and so on, right? I mean, today, of course, this has come to vogue, and people are evaluating building in Coimbatore or Jaipur and places like that, right? I've heard you say plenty of things around how you had to build an ecosystem itself. Like, for example, choosing to build an office on the highway, right? Where people, who are coming from Bombay or Bangalore can actually see Robosoft, right? And they won't have to tell their parents or whatever, and they'll be able to tell them that they're working for a reputable firm and everything like that. I wonder, there might have been like hundreds of things like that you would have had to invest in, right? So for people who are listening to this podcast, who are looking to build in tier 2 or tier 3 cities, what should they know about building in these cities?
Yeah, so there were a few things, and I'll tell you, why we really thought about, Udupi as a location. Okay, so Robosoft was initially founded in Mumbai. I started it out of my sister's house, an apartment in Mumbai. Okay. And for the first 2 years, internet had just come to India. Dial-up modem, I got my first connection from VSNL in India.
VSNL.
So I was probably the 81st or 82nd account holder in Mumbai. Okay. So that early, you can imagine. And the first 2 years of Robosoft, all the work that we did was for US clients. And they were not really bothered about where we were. They never once asked us, where is your office? Can you show us the office? And, after 2 years of working in this mode, I realized that if my customers are not really worried about where am I, why should I be? Okay, I think that's probably the most important trigger point for me. And I was trying to grow the team and all those things for myself, and putting a office space, hiring people was a little bit difficult, right? You are a single person entity, big city, and all those kind of things. And after 2 years, I decided that okay, this is not the place for me. Let me go to a smaller place, probably my native place, where it's easier to get a loan from bank and set up at least some kind of a presence, so that you can attract new people. Otherwise, you have to tell people, hey, look, I work out of somebody's home, and that was difficult to do that. So in '98, I moved to KRC STEP. They KRC or NITK now. They had this software technology entrepreneurs park, and they just built the building, one empty building, and I got to know of it because my friend was working there in the computer science department. So we went there and we started asking them, hey, look, can we use this? And they were like, okay, we built this facility, but we have not yet started it. I said, then it's okay, I'll start it. Just give me the space, rent out the space, and I'll start. So in a way, that whole facility got inaugurated because we started there. Okay, there was this building that was lying for 2 years, and suddenly we go there and they rent it out. We furnished it really well. I went to my alma mater, which is NITTE Engineering College, and spoke to the professor there, and we got a chance to do interview. And luckily for us, this was in a very early days in 1998, and we were able to get the best, technically the best people interviewing. And I myself, I'm from computer science background, and I used to love coding, and it was easy for us to pick the right kind of people. And that's how we started in a small way in Surathkal office. Okay, and we went from 5 people to 20 people in that. And then the same thing, they said, you can't be here because you have grown to 20 people, you need to move out. When we said, okay, we'll go to Udupi, because Udupi is where I was born and brought up. And again, at that time, STPI, the Software Technology Park of India, had opened a satellite station in Manipal. And they told, look, don't worry about internet, we will give you internet. And that was the key thing. So all through, the only thing we needed was internet, because Udupi, Manipal, Mangalore area is known for talent. There are 21 engineering colleges within 40 kilometers. I think that's the number one thing that you need, access to great talent. And we had plenty of it in our area. And I said, okay, only other thing I need is an internet and probably the will to make it succeed. And I think the rest of it kind of followed. There are a lot of struggles and all those things. I can, go on and on that part.
Yes. No, I'd love to hear any stories and anecdotes from the early days.
Yeah, so the early days was, one of the lessons I learned from Mumbai was, unless you have your own setup, people are not going to come and stay. So they hired a few people in Mumbai, and after a few months, they said, look, there's no office for us to come and sit. We don't want to work. So that's the first thing I fixed. As soon as I came to Surathkal, I made the office look really good, and that helped us, attract. And then I tried to work with KRC students, getting them to do internship in our facility and all those things. That was another reason why I chose, their step. But for me, it didn't really work out the way I thought. We'll get engineers, very bright engineers too. They had their own priorities in terms of what they wanted to do, and only when they need to get their projects done, they'll be there for the last 1 week, and you can't get anything, productive. At least I couldn't. And then I realized, okay, we have to probably go to Udupi and probably put together a bigger facility. And one thing we started doing, Roshan, was right from early days, we started forming good relationship with the engineering colleges around us. So we would always have a champion in the college, one of the professors, and he would always point us to the most bright kids out there, and that helped us attract the best people. And the second thing that we did was, all the projects that we took was cutting edge. Okay, right from the early days. Our first project was with Apple when we started the company, and after that, it was all on the cutting edge technology. So everybody who has been through Robosoft, loved the fact that they have been working on cutting edge. So we personally love to do cutting edge stuff. And, whenever we went to look out for projects, they were also in the same kind of space. And work-wise, everybody was very, very happy because they're doing something very new. And then we got into device drivers, again, cutting edge. Then we got into game development, cutting edge. Then we got into mobile, cutting edge. Then we got into design. So we were always about a few things. Okay, one is focus. We started with Apple Mac as a focus for our company. And then we said, okay, now we'll do device drivers. And that became the focus for us. Then so we always had focus, and we would only focus on a niche skill set and be extremely good at it, which helped us get a lot of referral customers.
Yeah, so one of the other early choices was building for the Apple ecosystem, right? You were a Mac developer in 96, 97, and then one of the earliest developers on iOS as well. In fact, I think Apple Worldwide Developers Conference, I think your apps were, part of the earliest apps as well,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
can you take us through the decision to build for Apple itself? Because, yes, I mean, today it's very, very apparent given how big the ecosystem is. But was it so clear that time, 20 years back or so on, that it would become such a huge ecosystem? And if you could take us through what was the thought process like at that time?
Yeah, so it basically started with what I was good at. So after my engineering in 92, I got a job in Osaka, Japan, and there was this company that was building a Japanese language word processor for the Mac platform. So as soon as I landed there, I got a Mac. I never seen a Mac in my life. I started reading about what are Macs, and then I got to know about Steve Jobs and all those amazing early engineers who were built. And this company was also all really Mac geeks. So we would talk about those early days of Mac story, and at that point in time, Apple was almost dying. Windows 85 was kind of killing them in every area. But I loved programming for the Mac because we were doing a highly cutting edge. At that point in time, we were trying to beat Microsoft Word in Japan. That was our motto. Okay, this word processor should be better than that, and that's what we were always beating. And for me personally, this whole thing about building something that is world class started from there, because we were kind of like a small company, and we were already thinking of defeating Microsoft. Okay, so we started with those very idealistic kind of thinking. And the second thing that impacted me was I went to Japan for the very first time, and it was a huge culture shock for me as a person. I just love the fact that there's a small country in the world which is challenging USA in every aspect at that time. They were buying all the Hollywood studios, their car companies were beating the Detroit companies, and the Japanese yen was a crazy valuation against the US dollar. So I was amazed that there is this country that was completely destroyed in World War II. Within 50 years, they did something like this, and I became a Japan lover kind of a thing. But when I came back to India, and in a way, this Japan was the main reason why I came back, because at that time, I thought, okay, in life, I have to do something, and I should go back to India and do it. If this country can become so advanced in 50 years, we should go back and try to make India, as advanced in another 50 years. So I thought, and I came back on a mission. And when you come back here, you want to start something, you don't know what to start, right? And I was good at Mac programming, and Apple at that time had just opened an office in India in 95, their first sales office, and there were, I think, 18 sales guys, but no tech guys. So as soon as they opened, I went to them and told them, look guys, and I'll be your tech guy, and you guys sell machine, and if you need any of those guys need any software, I will build that for you. And that time they were trying to build an Indian language kit, and we told them, I had done, my friends and I had done some Indian language projects on the side, and we said, okay, we will build it for you, we'll help you build it. And that was our first project. We built Apple built the Indian language kit for Mac platform, and they loved it, what we did for them. And within 2 years, they started referring us. They in fact put us on the Apple website that is accessible to everyone around the world, saying that Robosoft is one of the 8 companies we recommend companies from anywhere in the world to go and work with. And I think once Apple recommends it, some of our customers just said, oh, if you're good enough for Apple, you're good enough for us. So that was our sales pitch. Okay, now we are referred by Apple. Okay, deal is done.
So
Yeah.
we'll take a slight detour in our conversation and talk about Japan, right? Working with Japanese is, of course, a non-trivial thing because culturally they're very, very different, right? Even from the West, in fact, who we are used to, in fact, right? Given the outsourcing business has been about, 3 or 4 decades right now, right? So I think Japan, they consider building software like building bridges, right? It's either 100% done or not, right?
Yes.
They have a huge hang up for quality as such. And, for a startup, it must have been really difficult working with Japanese clients as well, right? But given that they hold you to such high standards, any examples, anecdotes, anything with respect to working with the Japanese itself?
Yeah, one is, the attention to details. So when we used to program, we used to really worry about 2 bytes and 4 bytes. So all the debugging that I did was, in assembly language. Even though we used to write code in C, all the debugging was in C language, and we used to optimize codes, based on, we would even know at the register level how we can optimize the code. So some of the learnings that I had even helped me in RoboSoft till 2 years ago when we were optimizing some stuff.
Right.
I would go in there and tell them, look, guys, this is not going to happen because I know internally how it's all going to translate. So we should not write it this way. But I think, if there is one thing that it taught me, that is all about efficiency. How much, attention to detail, worrying about 2 register, 4 bytes of RAM and things like that. And that whole sense of being, very, very optimized way of running in terms of quality, being very, very perfectionist, those things stayed. So, for us also in RoboSoft, it was always the same thing, quality, optimized, way of working. So some of these values, kind of stayed. It went down from that same, way. Everything we used to do, used to have that. Some of those things, flowed down subconsciously, they would say, right?
Right.
Because the first engineers we hired, we used to tell them the same. Oh, optimize. Your code should be clean, code should be neat. So those kind of things.
Right. One of the aspects of running a services business is that your destiny is in the hands of your customers, right? You get swayed depending on the type of customers and the type of projects that you take up. But you have very consciously tried to make those choices, right? You have tried to control your destiny yourselves while running the services business. So I wonder if you can talk about some of those principles on who you choose to work with, what kind of projects you pick up, and how that has helped you over the years.
Yeah. So one thing, we were always, focused on, we used to build in a mass market product. So whatever we build used to be used by, millions of people. So for example, we were, from early days, we were building device drivers for Hewlett Packard. We built it for Epson. We built it for Canon. And one of the things that we used to always say that, hey, look, if you screw up, there will be, millions of unhappy customers. So one was, focus is one thing, in the areas that we wanted to work. Second thing is, being, very quality oriented. When we're always, very, very hung up on, quality right from, day one. And third thing is sometimes, saying no, because we had to do that a lot along the way. People would say, look, can you do this as well? And gone off the path and try to do something, failed miserably, and then would go back and say, okay, let us stay focused. Let's stay focused. So we did that a lot. And whenever we focused, Roshan, I think it always, worked out for us.
And also, when you are a services business, it's also important to take pride in the work that you do and not really become yes man to clients. Whatever clients say, you will do that. You will not really think too much about how it can be better or whether quality wise or product wise and so on and so forth. So how do you build that customer empathy within the teams, right? So such that they start thinking in the shoes of the client itself and build the product like as so they would build their own product, right? And their own vision. I guess what I'm trying to say is that how do you help people do some amazing, great work in a services firm?
Yeah, I think, one of those things is, that there was a certain amount of humbleness with which we would, always tell our customers, look, if you do like this, we will do it if you want us to, but all these bad things will happen. We'll tell them in a nice way, and, most of the time, they would understand when we tell them, oh, something bad is going to happen in a very calm manner. They know that, okay, something really must be happening. So let us not take that path. So it is all about, ultimately, convincing them, Roshan, because most of the customers had high regard for our technical opinion. And if, some of our people said, look, we are going to get into trouble if we do this, they would just listen and say, look, Ram says, we shouldn't do. Ram was one of our early architect, and, he kind of trained a lot of our people on technology. And if he said no, means, for a customer also, he said no. So let us not go there, kind of a thing.
Right. I think it's important to have these difficult conversations with the customer, right? Because it just helps both parties involved, I feel, right?
Yes, you have to be ultimately be, very frank at it and tell them, because
Yeah.
the worst thing that can happen is they can turn around at some point in time and tell us, why did you tell us?
Mm.
Okay, so it's our ultimately it's our duty to warn them, but it's
Right.
their decision to either take it or leave it.
Right. So hiring engineers 20 years back versus hiring engineers now, I think there's a world of a difference. You were an engineer yourself, and so you could
Mhm,
build that engineering culture also very organically within the organization, right? So
mhm,
you could
mhm.
hire people who are brilliant and enable and build those training processes and everything, right? Can you talk us through some of the aspects of building an engineering culture?
Yeah, I think it started with us at the top, and it all started with this whole concept of writing efficient code and making sure that you document your code well, use design pattern, use object oriented in a way of thinking. And early days, it used to happen that sometimes when engineers start building, and the first thing they say is, "Hey, look, it can't be done." So, I would, we would say, or the customer would say, look, you have to do it this way. They would say, no, it can't be done. Then, we would sit down and do it and show it to them. Because,
Right.
we were programmers. It was, very easy. For me, I used to do that a lot in the early days, and, show them how it can be done. And once you show one person how it can be done, 10 people get to know about it. And when the next time they say it can't be done, they'll be very careful. Oh, he's going to sit and do it now. And that can be the worst thing that can happen to a very good, programmer. Somebody else, did my stuff. So, we were, I think that's the best way of inculcating the culture of development. How do you, how do you show that to other people themselves? And that helped us pull off some, incredibly stunning things in our team. Back then, it was all about making sure that the Mac app ran faster than the Windows app. And, we used to consistently deliver on that,
Right.
even though the processors were, underpowered than the Intel processors.
Right.
Yeah.
So it comes down to leading by example, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. I think in engineering, it is, if there's one lesson I've learned in engineering, you have to lead by example.
Right.
You have to show your team that. So it's basically about being a technical dada, ultimately,
Right.
So you have to have a technical dada in your team. If not the founder, somebody should be there, and who has the full confidence of the founder. I think once you have that, I think at least, with the programming and all, it will be a lot easier.
Right. So we'll shift our gaze towards 99 games. Can you take us through the genesis of building 99 games? And usually the gaming space is graveyard for so many types of people who have tried to build and like shut shop, right? I mean, it's such
Mhm.
a very very hard business. The shelf life of a game is like it ranges between few days to few weeks, right?
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
average shelf life. So how did you
Mhm.
pick such a difficult space to build in, and how have you
Mhm.
been successful in this space?
Yeah, in a way, I wouldn't call it we are a success as such, but we have had several successes, but not the ultimate success. But I'll tell you, how it all started, Roshan. So again, this has an Apple angle. Back in 2004, 2005, the consoles were becoming very popular, the PlayStation, the Sega and all those things. And PC gaming was on the decline.
Hmm.
And because Mac had only 5% of the market share, it was even in a even terminal decline. And so so much so that the bigger game publishers stopped porting their games to Mac. They said, look, there's not enough machines to sell our software, so we're not going to. And Apple was in a dilemma because they used to get a lot of people buying their systems because of these Mac games. And they reached out to us, saying that, hey, Robosoft, we have all these publishers who don't want to do it themselves. Do you want to do it on their behalf? And we kind of pitched in, and we started being a porting house for games of choice for Apple. Again, they put us prominently on their game page, saying that, hey, look, if you have a game, don't want to do it, go to them. At all the large conferences, they would call us into the meeting with all these publishers like EA, Ubisoft, and all those things, and tell them, hey, look, can you work with them? So by I think around by 2010, 2009, 2010, half the titles on Mac platform were built by Robosoft. So if you went to an Apple retail store in 2010 and just turned around the CD jacket, you would see the Robosoft logo. because by then, we realized that, we should start getting some mileage out of all these things. So every time a Mac game was launching, our logo would show up, and every time a CD got sold, it had the Robosoft logo, prominently at the background. And that kind of gave us that whole introduction into gaming, because the titles that we were working on were some of the best titles in the world, like Fable, Black and White, the whole Lego series, a lot of these titles. And I think that got us into gaming. We had a pretty large gaming team, and when this whole app store magic was happening, the whole and games are going on, we initially started offering the same services to port the games onto iPhones and Android. But then this whole freemium gaming started, and we realized that, okay, the games that we build are winning awards for our customers, for so many years now. So why don't we start a studio which not just builds and gives it, but we conceptualize, we design, and we market, and we sell. And that was the genesis of 99 Games, that feeling that, okay, we should own the brand. So while Robosoft is a services, it's a B2B business, 99 Games was a B2C business. Here is, we conceptualize, we design, we develop, we market, we monetize, we run, we operate everything, all on, that's all on 99 Games itself. And we started in the early days. One of the first games that we did very well. We went into the top 10 on Apple App Store, and that was like it was like a huge moment for us. So we were, I think, below one of the market leader, and as soon as we went to the top 10, we were kind of hooked on to that.
Right. So this was the MasterChef game, is it?
No, this was not even. It was even before MasterChef. There was a word game called Wordsworth, which we had done.
Right.
Okay, so the Star Chef, as a game, that released in 2015. So right. That was our second coming of 99 Games. There was our foray into freemium games as well.
Right.
Which even after 5 years continues to monetize now. So that comes to your point about gaming. So a lot of people have this misconception that gaming is small, transitionary, and all those things. But the kind of games that we build is something we call as forever franchises. People, once they start playing it, they play for 5 years, 10 years. So we have some players of Star Chef who have been playing the game since beta in 2014, and they still play now, even to this day. That is almost 6 years they have been playing the game. Oh. And if we don't release something, they'll reach out to us and say, look, you haven't added this. You haven't added a summer theme. What happened to the Halloween theme? All those kind of things. They're very, very demanding that way.
So, to me, it appears like two different businesses, right? Very, very different businesses, B2B versus B2C, and then services versus products. And I'm sure there are plenty of other nuances, right? But what was the mindset shift required to go from services to products? Because I think literally if you poll any services company in Bangalore or elsewhere, they would all have nursed this ambition of becoming a product company someday, right? Building product of ours, right? So what are those 2 or 3 things that you did to shift this mindset and, again, that really paid dividends for you?
Yeah, it's incredibly hard, Roshan, to build a product company out of a services company. It's incredibly hard. If somebody asks me, will you do it again? I will not do it. So it is incredibly hard, because in services company, you are kind of conditioned to do what the customer asks you to.
Correct.
Right? The customer is there telling us, what needs to be done. And we didn't realize it in the early days of these companies that, that part is the very difficult part. We thought, okay, we are building all this stuff on our own, and how difficult can it be to conceptualize, and how difficult can it be to sell it, right? Because we thought App Store has come, democratization of distribution, and all those things. But that mindset is very different. For a product company, you are supposed to ideate, you are supposed to come up with stuff. Whereas with the services company, somebody is telling you what. Okay, that's the number one. Number two, when we started these product entities, we were always worried, right? There is, we have to worry about the cash flows, and we have to make sure that the best people are still working on the services, so that, we can dabble with the products on the side. So we started the services business with the product business with very young 1 year, 2 year experienced people, but extremely bright people who had that drive, that spark, and all those things, who wanted to do something very different. So we kind of from the pool of people whom we had, we looked for people with that bent. We're not saying that the people who don't have that bent don't make great engineers. They do, but they have a particular. These people always have that specific thing of trying to do things that have not been attempted before. And who better than just people just 1 year out of college to think like that?
No baggage, basically. They don't have any baggage of experience. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
They come with this very idealistic thinking, and we told them, look, we can do it, and the best way, like I said, is always to show that it can be done, and then they will do it. And so for us, and that was one thing. Second thing is they don't come with the whole services thinking. Okay, they come with they are a clean slate for us, so we could write it the any which way we want. So that kind of helped us to build that team, incubate that team in the Robosoft itself. So first 2-3 years we kind of incubated the team, and only in 2013 we kind of transferred them all onto the roles of 99 games. And 2015, we raised our first round, those kind of things.
So,
but there was a solid period of 2-3 years of incubation while we are still figuring out what to do.
Right. So on my tweet, you had replied, right, that now time to think 10x with 99 games, right? So I, what is your vision with the 99 games going forward? So how are you going to reset right now and look ahead into the future with 99 games?
See, gaming is a huge business, right? It's, if you know the market, they say it's a $200 billion business. And a lot of people just go in thinking that it's a huge business. You can sit in India, you can build, products of the world market, right? So Robosoft had the history of, sitting in India and, building product for the world market. Most of the work that we did in our history was for world market. And when we even thought of doing all these things, even back in 2010, we always had the world market in mind. And we said that, there is an app store and you just put stuff there and, it'll get distributed. What better can it be, right? For you to get a distribution. And because we had a history of, doing this stuff, we said, let us attempt it. And now where we see ourselves, we had a early success with, StarChef 2. It helped us understand that, particular domain or a particular, we call it genre. Okay, it's a subcategory, within the large category of, games that you can build. And we choose that, okay, there is this builder/tycoon kind of genre, which we are good at. And let us build this expertise in this. And once we know how to build a great game, we can probably, make that into a very large franchise. So for example, the most successful, builder/tycoon kind of a game in the world is, making $600 million in revenue. So, and they are, not even in US, they're in Russia. So, if you look at, more recent example of a Turkish gaming studios. So some of the biggest acquisitions that Zynga did was, gaming studios out of Turkey, where their own market is very small, but they have this expertise of building global games. And then, Zynga goes in and buys them for 250 million, 450 million, 600 million, kind of, studios. And I feel there is an opportunity for India to get into that kind of a space, where we can, if you are good and if you, stay focused on, one or two genres, we can build games and, scale them larger. So for example, for a StarChef, we were able to generate around $30 million in revenue from one title. So when I say 10x, my vision is to now, take that from 30x to 300 million. Okay, so when I say 10x, okay, now can we take StarChef now to a 300 million game kind of a franchise? Once we get to 300, we'll think, oh, maybe, we can take the next one to 3 billion. So that is what, entrepreneurs are, right? We try to dream of crazy things. Half the time we succeed and half the time we fail, but time will tell.
Right. So it's a nice segue to one of my final questions, which is that, the Indian startup ecosystem, right, has come a long way in the last 25 years. 96, 97, when you started, I think startups were still sort of a niche career choice. Whereas if you contrast it to today, I mean, everyone really wants to work in a startup or at least found a startup, right? One of the two. So you've seen tremendous change in this time and you've seen the startups evolve itself, right? So what are you optimistic for going forward from a startup perspective?
So there are two things. One is there's an opportunity that is becoming bigger and bigger in the India market itself. That's number one. And the second thing is there's an opportunity equally large, or if not larger opportunity, if you target the world market. And for us, when we started 99 Games and these entities, we had such a hard time convincing investors that you can sit in India and build games for the world market. Okay, right. And people would investors would just laugh us off the room, saying that and that too in Udupi, you must be completely crazy. And till this whole SaaS ecosystem has started building global businesses, right. I think even at the investor level, people are not really believing that you can sit in India and build products for the world market. And what makes me so much more excited and optimistic about the future is that investors are now realizing that you can sit here and create a consumer app not just for India but for a world market. So why be satisfied with a 2 billion market when there is a 200 billion market out there? And I see that as a huge scope and opportunity for startups in India, not just to think about doing for India, but probably thinking of doing much beyond India.
Yeah. The markets have exploded, right? I mean, both the domestic and the fact that, as you mentioned, you can sell to the world right now. So on that note, what is some advice that you would offer to anyone who is looking to start up in this sort of a market today?
Yeah, I would say, I think one or two things that come to my mind is, one is, pick up a skill set or pick up an area which you are really good at, okay, which you are incredibly passionate about. And from a skill set, you have a fit, or one of your founder partner has that, skill set and knows that domain or knows that a particular area very well. Second thing is, perseverance. And startup is, incredibly hard. At least, for me, it was hard. It's hard, but it is enriching, satisfying at the end of it. But perseverance is pretty important, and stay focused. I think a lot of times I've seen, even when we used to build product for startups from RoboSort, we used to see a lot of founders, they would just keep pivoting every 3 months or every 6 months. Oh, we have to pivot, this is not working. I'm like, 3 months, what have you figured out for you to pivot? Understood, right? But I used to always find it very, very crazy that they would just pivot in 3 months, even when the product was hardly out there. Right. So things that worked for us was focus and perseverance. I'm not saying that it works for everyone, but it works for us.
Right. Wonderful. So this was a really, really enjoyable conversation. I really liked talking to you, and congratulations again, and all the best for the journey ahead, Rohit. Thank you so much again for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Roshan. Thank you for inviting.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.